All the heroes received great powers, and I got an unknown skill. They called me trash, thought I was contagious, and threw me into the abyss to be eaten by monsters. But they miscalculated one thing. My skill is devour. The more monsters I eat, the stronger I become. I made a decision to devour all the creatures here, and then return and destroy this entire rotten world, along with the heroes and their church. But let's start the story from the very beginning. The night forest breathed damp air, and smoke from the small campfire crawled between the trees in low gray ribbons. Kang Ha-jun crouched beside the flames, scraping a charred branch with his pocket knife, while his backpack rested against the root of a pine. The lighter in his jacket pocket pressed against his fingers, and that tiny piece of metal comforted him more than the dying fire. The trip was supposed to be an ordinary school escape from the city noise, and from faces among which he always disappeared. Ha-jun expected nothing from the night, except a cold morning, cheap noodles, and the road back home. Yet the silence around the campfire grew too heavy, as if the forest had held its breath before he even noticed. First, the insects went silent. Then the branches stopped moving, even though the wind had been tugging at the treetops a moment earlier. Sparks above the campfire hung in the air, as if invisible fingers had caught them. Ha-jun slowly lifted his head, and the skin on the back of his neck tightened, with the feeling that something enormous was watching him. Thin lines of light appeared beneath his shoes, like cracks spreading through black glass. They crawled across the ground, passing through dry leaves, stones, and roots without burning them, carving a foreign pattern into the darkness. Ha-jun stumbled backward, but the circle had already closed around him, swallowing the campfire, his backpack, and even his shadow. The air struck his chest so sharply that he lost balance and dropped to one knee. His backpack jerked off the ground, the knife slipped from his fingers, and the campfire stretched upward into a tall pillar of white flame. The last thing Ha-jun felt in the forest was ash on his tongue, and the metal edge of his lighter biting through his pocket. White light tore the world out from under his feet. The tree trunks, fire, and night sky broke into shapeless streaks that spun around him with sickening speed. Ha-jun tried to breathe, but his lungs filled with emptiness, and for one terrible moment, it felt as though his body had been pulled into a thin, fragile thread. He struck cold stone with his shoulder, and pain gave the world its shape again. Around him, other people fell one after another, some in school uniforms, some in office shirts, some in casual clothes, and their frightened faces reflected in the polished floor. Above them rose the vault of a vast cathedral, so high that its stained glass windows vanished into golden mist. The magic circle beneath their bodies faded slowly, as though the stone were drinking it back. Dozens of summoned people pushed themselves onto their elbows, clutched their heads, and looked around while their fear thickened into a low roar. Ha-jun found his backpack beside him, then his knife, and only after that could he make his fingers release the lighter in his pocket. As he stood, he felt how out of place his dark hiking jacket and dirty sneakers looked in that marble hall. People from his world surrounded him, yet the towering columns, the smell of incense, and the strange symbols on the walls made them seem like prisoners inside another world's dream. Some cried, some demanded answers, and some tried recording, though their screens showed only static. The heavy doors at the far end of the hall opened with a dull scrape, and the noise among the summoned began to die on its own. People in white robes entered the cathedral in ordered rows, golden symbols shining on their chests, and their faces held still. They moved so calmly that dozens of abducted strangers seemed like an expected part of the ritual. Among the faces, Ha-jun suddenly recognized Yoon So-ra, the senior from his school, whom people used to watch even in the hallways. She stood farther away in her neat uniform, her hair disturbed by the summoning, and her face pale. Yet people were already gathering around her. Even inside this stone nightmare, the old school hierarchy pulled toward her like filings to a magnet. The last to enter was a tall man in a white robe, and the stained glass light gathered behind him in a golden circle. His face seemed gentle, almost sorrowful, but Ha-jun noticed how quickly the priests around him lowered their eyes. There was more fear than reverence in that motion, though none of the summoned understood the difference yet. Beside him stood a woman, with platinum hair pulled so tightly that her face looked carved from cold porcelain. Thin rings on her fingers glowed in rhythm with the symbols on the floor, and the stone beneath the summoned began to breathe with pale light again. She looked over the crowd like an overseer counting vessels rather than people. The archbishop spoke with measured calm, and his voice spread through the cathedral so evenly that the stone walls seemed to repeat every word. He explained that this world stood at the edge of ruin, that the great demon devoured the lands of Iria, and that people from another world had been summoned as the final hope. The crowd listened hungrily, desperate for any clear story. As he spoke of salvation, the floor near the altar opened, revealing a pedestal with a huge transparent orb. Gray sparks drifted inside it, slowly turning gold, as if the object were waking in the presence of summoned souls. The Archbishop declared that each of them would receive a divine gift, and for the first time, fear in the crowd mixed with dangerous hope. Selena drew her staff through the air, and glowing lines on the floor stretched into a narrow path toward the orb. The summoned were placed in line with gentle precision, making resistance feel awkward and pointless. Ha-Jun ended up near the back, his backpack over one shoulder and his knife tucked deeper into his pocket, where his fingers searched for its handle again. Heat rolled over the nearest people, and the line recoiled at once, but awe was already spreading across their frightened faces. The man stared at his own hand, unable to believe the fire did not burn him, while the priests behind him exchanged satisfied looks. Ha-Jun felt envy prick his chest, followed almost immediately by shame. The next girl received lightning, and the air around her smelled of ozone, like the breath before a summer storm. Blue arcs danced across her shoulders and hair without harming her, lighting the hall in sharp flashes. Several people in line began to smile, no longer imagining only a way home, but themselves standing at the center of this new world. When Lee Do-yoon touched the orb, the golden light did not spread over his body, but gathered before him into a long, shining shape. A sword emerged from the radiance, its white blade marked with celestial symbols, and a wave of involuntary awe passed through the hall. Do-yoon took the weapon with the confidence of someone seeing an old belief confirmed. Park Min-jae received fire rougher and fiercer than the first summoned man. Flames wrapped his fists in dense orange rings, charring the edges of his sleeves, and he clenched his hands as everyone nearby stepped away. In his smile, Ha-Jun saw not the relief of a rescued person, but the excitement of someone suddenly given permission to crush the weak. When Yoon So-ra's turn came, the air in the hall seemed easier to breathe. The orb answered her with pure turquoise light, and a wind rose around her, lifting her hair and the edges of her uniform. People nearby looked at her as though she had been born for a scene of salvation, rather than dragged here from ordinary school life. After that, the line moved faster, because fear had given way to hungry expectation. Stone plates appeared on one person's skin, a glowing bow opened in another's hand, and healing symbols flared behind someone else. The cathedral filled with color and noise, and with them came a new division between those who shone and those still waiting. Those with bright gifts began gravitating toward one another, talking, comparing powers, and testing gestures that made their magic obey more easily. Those who received faint light or did not understand their abilities stood nearer the walls, trying to appear calm. Ha-Jun watched a new order form before his eyes, faster than any hierarchy he had known at school. Waiting became a physical pressure beneath his ribs. Ha-Jun looked at his hands, still smudged with soot from the campfire, and tried to imagine what color would flare around them. Somewhere inside him, a timid hope rose that this world might give him what the old one never had, a strength impossible to ignore. Selena stood beside the pedestal and recorded each result with a small movement of her fingers. The rings on her hands blinked in different colors, as though storing the qualities of each new vessel, though her face remained composed. As the line shortened, she looked more often into the orb than at the people, as if expecting a particular answer. The Archbishop blessed each awakened hero with a gentle gesture, and the stronger ones answered him with grateful eyes. Ha-Jun noticed that the church leader's smile barely changed, no matter how many wonders flared before him. Only his shadow on the floor seemed longer than it should have been, beneath the stained glass light. By the time only a few people remained ahead of him, Ha-Jun's palms had grown damp. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, though it sat properly on his shoulder, then touched the hidden knife, as if checking whether the last piece of his former life had vanished. Behind him, someone was already discussing what monsters they might face first. At last, Selena turned her cold gaze toward him, and the path of light beneath his feet brightened. Ha-Jun stepped toward the pedestal, hearing his own breathing sound too loud between the voices around him. With every step, Do-yoon's sword, So-ra's wind, and Min-jae's flames seemed like higher peaks receding farther from reach. He paused before the orb, for a brief moment, though Selena had already lifted her chin impatiently. The smooth surface reflected his face in a stretched, distorted shape, as if another Ha-Jun stared from inside it, paler and more lost. Then he breathed out and placed his palm against the cold glass. The orb's cold passed through his skin so deeply that his fingers cramped. Something shifted inside the transparent sphere, but instead of bright color, murky gray rings rose like ash drifting through water. They spread slowly from his palm and began fading just as slowly, leaving the hall with a silence heavier than any shout. Ha-Jun waited for heat, wind, the weight of a weapon in his hand, or even pain that would prove something inside him had opened, but his body remained the same, weak and trembling from the summoning. The gray light did not rise past his wrist, as if the orb itself refused to acknowledge the result. For the first time, Selena's rigid composure broke. She leaned toward the orb so quickly that the silver belt of her robe struck the pedestal, while the rings on her fingers flared with pale sparks. In her eyes, Ha-jun caught not anger, but a brief flash of fear, hidden almost instantly behind a cold mask. The priests behind her began exchanging quick glances, and their whispers rustled through the hall like mice beneath the floorboards. Ha-jun could not make out the words, but he saw several faces tighten with irritation. The archbishop remained where he stood, and his smile became motionless, like a thin layer of gold over dead wood. Selena gestured for him to remove his hand, and the gray rings vanished into the orb without leaving a spark. The stone beneath his feet stopped glowing, as though the ritual had ended with a failed breath. Ha-jun lowered his palm and saw no mark on his skin. The archbishop approached the altar slowly, giving the crowd time to understand that something had gone wrong. In his gentle voice, he explained the result as a rare emptiness, unable to manifest a gift in a usable form. He sounded almost regretful, but Ha-jun heard irritation beneath the smooth words, like a man handed a broken tool. Confusion in the crowd changed shape quickly. People who had trembled beside him on the stone floor only moments earlier now looked at him as if his weakness might be contagious. Several summoned with bright gifts quietly shifted away, leaving an empty space around Ha-jun that felt wider than the entire cathedral. Du-yun rested his hand on the hilt of his shining sword and looked at Ha-jun with almost polite disappointment. Min-jae, by contrast, smirked openly, letting the fire around his knuckles flare a little brighter. Those looks struck harder than words, because judgment had already been passed inside them. Ha-jun tried to straighten, but his shoulders tightened, as if under a rain of small stones. He felt dozens of eyes on him, and could not decide where to put his hands, which suddenly seemed useless. A school hallway surfaced in his mind, where people had passed him just as easily, only now indifference carried the weight of a sentence. He clenched his fingers, trying to feel even the smallest change beneath his skin. No heat came, no chill, no pressure of magic, only a faint ache in his joints from squeezing too hard. Ha-jun understood that he stood among people with weapons and elements, while remaining the same boy who had sat beside a campfire minutes earlier. Selena made a brief mark in the air, and her rings swallowed a gray spark, as if closing an unpleasant account. After that, she no longer looked at him as a participant in the ritual. To her, Ha-jun had already become an error, to be pushed aside, so the true heroes could continue. The stories about monsters and the great demon no longer sounded like distant legend. Ahead waited raids, training, battles, and a foreign world where weakness could not hide behind school walls. Ha-jun imagined his own death here for the first time with clarity. Not heroic, but quick, filthy, and unnecessary to anyone. The archbishop turned toward the stronger summoned, and with that simple movement, placed Ha-jun outside their shared fate. The priests began rearranging the rows, guiding those with bright gifts closer to the altar. Ha-jun remained behind, like an object not yet discarded, only because too many witnesses were still nearby. Even those whose gifts seemed weak did not want to stand near him. Their steps were small and awkward, yet each one carved a wider circle of loneliness around Ha-jun. He saw shame on their faces, and understood they were not pushing him away out of hatred, but out of fear of taking his place. In only a few minutes, his name, face, and past had shrunk into a single, gray result. The strong no longer saw him as a companion in misfortune. The weak feared being compared to him, and the church already considered the power spent on him a mistake. Ha-jun stood inside that empty circle, as hope quietly turned into shame. After the ceremony, the priest led the summoned from the ritual hall through a wide archway. Ha-jun walked at the back, trying not to fall behind, though no one checked whether he followed anymore. As they moved, the smell of incense gave way to cold stone dampness, and somewhere ahead, a deep, hollow rumble began to sound. The new hall had been built around a monstrous circular abyss. Stone bridges and chains crossed its upper edge, yet the bottom remained invisible, even under the glow of magical lamps. Air moved upward from the pit, carrying the smell of mold, blood, and something ancient that had rotted far too long in darkness. The archbishop presented the place as a sacred boundary between the human world and the depths where monsters bred. He explained that the dungeon would become their first road towards strength, and that the church would guide the true heroes through safe routes. Ha-jun felt the word true settle between him and the others like a stone slab. The group shifted closer to the altar platform again, and Ha-jun found himself at the edge of the movement. The underground wind tugged at his jacket, pulling the fabric toward the abyss, as if it already knew where he would fall. He stepped forward, wanting to stand near at least one familiar person, and his eyes found Sora. Sora stood among those whose gifts shone brighter than the rest. The wind around her had calmed, but it still moved strands of her hair, forming an almost sacred frame around her. To Ha-jun, she was not salvation or someone close, but proof that this nightmare remained tied to the old world by a thin thread. A school hallway flashed in his memory, where So-ra walked past with a light smile, and people stepped aside without being asked. Ha-jun had never spoken more than a few words to her, but now that thin connection felt almost like an anchor. He convinced himself that a familiar face could not turn away as easily as strangers had. He approached her carefully, gripping the strap of his backpack until his fingers whitened. Each step felt heavier than the last, because people around them had begun noticing his movement. Several stronger heroes turned their heads, and the empty space that had surrounded Ha-jun seemed to follow him like a trail of dirt. The crowd's attention reached So-ra before Ha-jun came close enough to speak. Her shoulders tightened, and her eyes darted from him to the people around them, who were already tying them together with invisible judgment. In that instant, school habit proved stronger than fear of the new world. Beside her stood the one just labeled useless. So-ra stepped back too sharply, and her gift answered her fear before she could control it. Turquoise wind tore from her shoulders, coiled around her arms, and struck forward in a dense wave. Ha-jun saw her widened eyes, saw his own reflection inside that fear, and understood that she was protecting not her body, but her place among the strong. The blow struck his chest and drove all the air from his lungs. The floor vanished beneath his feet. His backpack jerked his shoulder backward, and the temple walls smeared into gray and gold streaks. Ha-jun tried to grab the nearest edge of the bridge, but his fingers only scraped across cold stone, leaving torn skin behind. For one brief moment, he hung at the edge, held only by the torn strap of his backpack, caught on a protruding stone. The fabric cracked, chips of rock fell into the abyss, and the wind from below struck his face with rotten cold. Feet flashed before his eyes, close enough to see, yet impossibly far away. The strap gave way. Ha-jun's body dropped, and the upper temple rushed away, shrinking into a bright circle, framed by hanging ribs of stone. Instinctively, he reached upward, but instead of a hand, he caught only empty air, damp and heavy like the breath of some buried beast. At the edge of the abyss, everyone froze, and for 1 second, even the shining gifts stopped moving. So-ra pressed her hands to her chest, the wind around her breaking into ragged scraps, while Do-yoon stepped forward, but stopped before reaching the edge. No one jumped, no one threw a rope, and no one understood how quickly rescue required action. The archbishop approached the edge with sorrowful calm that looked far too prepared. He did not order anyone to find a way down, and did not allow panic to grow, only drawing the crowd's attention back with gentle gesture. The priests began moving the summoned away from the abyss, treating what had happened as a tragic loss already decided by the dungeon. Meanwhile, Ha-jun kept falling, spinning through the icy current, while the cathedral light above shrank into a trembling star. His scream struck the walls of the abyss and returned in broken echoes, softer with every heartbeat. Then the upper temple vanished behind jutting stone, and the world became only darkness, speed, and the pain waiting somewhere below. The fall lasted so long that fear dulled into stunned numbness. Ha-jun struck stone ledges, scraped his shoulder against rock, lost all sense of direction, and dropped lower again before his body could understand where the sky had gone. The backpack on his back jerked like a foreign weight, sometimes softening a blow and sometimes twisting his spine with fresh pain. Something wet swelled up below him, and the next impact was not stone, but slime. Ha-jun's body crashed into a thick layer of translucent sludge, mixed with bone fragments and gray pieces of rotting flesh. The blow still drove through his chest, and something on his right side cracked so softly that the sound nearly vanished inside the wet squelch. Slime flooded his mouth and nose, forcing him to choke on a rotten taste. Ha-jun clawed with both hands, trying to reach solid ground, but his fingers slipped over wet bones, and every movement split his side with burning pain. At last, his palm found stone, and he dragged himself from the foul mass, leaving a dark trail behind. The floor beneath him was cold and uneven, and a low cavern stretched around him, lit by rare mushrooms glowing a dim green. Somewhere far away, water dripped, each drop striking inside his temples like a tiny hammer. Ha-jun rolled onto his back and regretted it at once, because the broken rib seemed to drive deeper into his flesh. His breath came in short jerks, each inhale catching in his chest like a sharp hook. In the gloom, he searched his body with trembling hands, finding a split lip, skinned fingers, a bruised shoulder, and the backpack miraculously hanging from one strap. The knife was still there, and so was the lighter, but that discovery brought only a small, almost humiliating relief. When he tried to stand, his legs folded so quickly they seemed to belong to someone else. His knee struck stone, a rasp tore from his chest, and for several moments the world narrowed to the wet floor before his face. After the third attempt, Ha-jun stopped trying to rise and crawled toward a narrow crack between two slabs of rock. The crack was so tight that he had to push the backpack ahead of him, scraping its fabric against stone. Ha-jun squeezed in after it, pulled his knees to his stomach, and nearly fainted from the burst of pain in his side. Outside, the cavern seemed wider and more dangerous when seen from a hiding place that left him only a thin slit of view. Inside the crack, the air smelled of dust, damp stone, and his own blood. Ha-jun tried to breathe more quietly, though each breath scraped painfully through his chest, and listened to the distant sounds of the dungeon. Wet chewing, scraping, brief shrieks, and heavy dragging somewhere deeper formed the language of a place that had no need for humans. After several minutes, he pulled out the lighter and flicked it, shielding the flame with his hand. The small fire showed dirt on his sleeves, bloody streaks across his fingers, and a dark stain spreading beneath his jacket near his ribs. The flame trembled with his breathing, and Ha-jun trembled with it, fixing his eyes on the only familiar light. At first, he waited for voices from above. In his mind, he stubbornly pictured torches, ropes, and priests descending for the lost summoned boy. Because even a useless person was still a person. With every passing minute, that picture grew weaker, while the silence above him spread wider, filling the place where hope should have remained. He had to extinguish the lighter and spark it again until his thumb hurt from the wheel. Whenever darkness returned, Ha-jun wrapped his arms around his knees and counted his heartbeats, because otherwise his thoughts crawled back toward the edge of the abyss. At some point, he stopped knowing how much time had passed, and the cavern felt like the only world left to him. So-ra's image returned more often than the others. Not her face from the school hallway, but that brief moment at the edge, when her fear struck harder than the wind itself. Ha-jun saw the people above looking down at him again and again, and his fingers dug into his sleeves as if they could hold him inside the present. By the time thirst began gluing his tongue to the roof of his mouth, the tears had dried on his dirty cheeks. The pain in his rib had become deep and constant, like a heated nail left inside his chest. Ha-jun understood then that rescue was not delayed on its way. It had never been sent. Outside came a new sound, thin and scratching, as if a bundle of needles were being dragged across stone. Ha-jun slowly turned his head toward the slit and saw a shadow in the dim mushroom light, moving too smoothly to be rock. Several small eyes shone one after another, and then a spider the size of a dog crawled from the passage. The cave spider stopped near the patch of slime where Ha-jun had fallen earlier and moved its mandibles, tasting the air. Its legs stepped almost silently, yet every touch against stone sent a thin vibration into the crack. Ha-jun clamped a hand over his mouth so hard his nails cut his lip, and watched the creature slowly turn toward his hiding place. As the spider came closer, Ha-jun searched through the backpack with fingers stiff from cold and terror. The knife settled into his palm, far too small, almost laughable against mandibles and bristling legs. Then he pulled out the crumpled rope, and its rough fibers gave his hands something to do before panic could tear him open from within. One front leg slid into the crack, feeling through the space before his face. Ha-jun jerked backward, struck the back of his head against stone, and barely held a cry behind clenched teeth. The spider could not force its full body inside, but its patient, methodical movement showed that the creature knew how to wait for prey. To the left of the crack ran a narrow passage Ha-jun had only noticed from the corner of his eye. It was wide enough for a person, and tight enough that the huge creature would struggle to turn freely. The idea did not come as courage, but as the last chance to force his fear into a useful shape. When the spider's legs slid back out, Ha-jun began tying the rope around a stone protrusion near the entrance. The knot came out uneven because of his trembling, and the fibers slipped from his fingers several times, cutting new red lines across his scraped skin. Every small sound felt louder than a cave-in. But outside the crack, the spider only shifted, tasting the air. When the knot was finished, Ha-jun crawled out on all fours, pressing the knife against his forearm so the blade would not ring against stone. The spider noticed at once, and all its eyes turned toward him together. That gaze weakened the muscles in his legs, but the rough rope in his hand reminded him it was too late to crawl back. The creature lunged faster than he had expected. Ha-jun ran for the passage, but the broken rib stabbed him so sharply that his stride twisted into a limping stagger. Behind him, legs scraped against stone, and the spider's hot, sour breath touched the back of his neck before he reached the first bend. At the mouth of the passage, Ha-jun dropped onto his side and slid across the wet stone. The spider lunged after him, but the corridor's narrowness forced its body against the wall, twisting one leg under its own weight. The creature's cry was thin and shrill, almost childlike, which made the whole scene feel even more horrifying. The rope stretched low across the floor, tightened between the protruding stone and the edge where Ha-Jun had managed to loop it. He pressed himself against the wall beyond the bend, felt blood run down his fingers, and pulled with the last strength he had. The fibers bit into his palm, but the loop rose just as the spider surged forward. The spider's front legs tangled, and its heavy body flipped with a wet crash. Its mandibles snapped against the floor, striking sparks from the stone, while the corridor filled with frantic scraping. Ha-Jun saw one faceted eye exposed, huge and glistening, and understood he would not get another chance like this. His injured rib flared like fire when he threw himself onto the fallen creature. The knife did not enter at once. It slid against the hard rim of the eye, sending the shock up to his elbow. Ha-Jun bit his lip, pressed both hands onto the handle, and drove the blade deeper until hot fluid pulsed beneath his fingers. The spider thrashed, and the narrow passage became a mill of legs, stone, and blood. One bristling limb sliced Ha-Jun's forearm from wrist to elbow, leaving a wound that immediately filled with black grime. The boy was thrown off the creature's body, struck the wall with his back, and almost lost the knife from his slick fingers. As the spider tried to rise, Ha-Jun found the lighter and sparked it close to the mandibles. The tiny flame could not burn the creature, but the sudden light made it recoil and shield its damaged eye. That was enough for him to lunge forward again, pressing the knife with his whole weight into the soft depth of the wound. This time the blade sank to the hilt. The spider arched, struck the tunnel ceiling with the back of its body, and scraped its legs so fiercely that stone dust fell into Ha-Jun's hair. The boy did not release the knife, even when the mandibles caught his shoulder, tearing through jacket fabric and skin beneath it. The creature's convulsions slowly weakened, becoming only scattered twitches of its legs. Ha-Jun kept pressing on the handle, though almost no strength remained in his arms, and his breath came in short, painful bursts. When the spider finally went limp, the boy slid from its body and collapsed onto the stone beside the open wound. For a while, he sat beside the corpse, unable to believe the scraping was no longer coming closer. The knife trembled in his hand so badly that blood shook from the blade in tiny drops. Victory brought no relief. With it came pain, thirst, and hunger, tightening around his stomach with increasing cruelty. After several minutes, Ha-Jun tore a strip from his sleeve and tried to bind his cut forearm. The knot came out weak, the cloth darkened with blood at once, and his fingers numbed from exhaustion. Each time his eyes fell on the dead spider, his stomach clenched painfully, as though his body had reached a decision before his mind. The backpack offered almost nothing. The flask had cracked during the fall, the remaining food had turned into wet mush, and the rope was dirty and uselessly short after the trap. Ha-Jun sorted through these things like proof of his former life, but they could no longer protect him from what hunger demanded. In the end, the knife returned to his hand, now turned not against an enemy, but against the corpse. Ha-Jun cut away a small piece of pale spider flesh and held it over the lighter's flame, grimacing at the smell. The little fire licked the meat weakly and unevenly, leaving only black spots across the surface. His fingers slipped from the wheel, and the flame went out. In the darkness, the piece of flesh seemed heavier than stone, though it barely filled his palm. Ha-Jun held it before his face for a long time, feeling saliva gather in his mouth, along with disgust, and hated his body for still wanting to live. The first bite barely passed his throat. The meat was cold and rubbery, filled with bitter metallic fluid that spread across his tongue and brought nausea rushing up. Ha-Jun bent over the stone, but his stomach, empty and furious, held the prey inside, as if the dungeon's hunger itself had crested down into him. After the first piece, the second went down more easily, and that frightened him more. Ha-Jun ate in small, spasmodic bites, washing the vile taste down with saliva and tears that rose again from the pain in his throat. With every movement of his jaw, the dead spider looked less like a monster and more like his only chance to survive the night. The pain arrived suddenly, as if what he had eaten had awakened inside him and started searching for a way out. Ha-Jun collapsed onto his side, clawing at the stone, while dark lines crawled through the veins of his arms and neck. Heat rose from his stomach into his chest, struck his head, and the cavern swam in green circles. His body seized in waves, one convulsion rolling into the next, leaving him unable to breathe deeper than a short gasp. Dark saliva ran from his mouth, his fingers bent, and beneath his nails, it felt as if thin needles were moving. Ha-Jun fought to stay conscious, fixing his eyes on the faint mushroom glow across the wall. The cut on his forearm began to itch so fiercely that pain gave way for a moment to a new kind of terror. The bandage tightened, The soaked blood darkened, and the edges of the wound slowly crawled toward each other, leaving a grayish scar beneath the skin. Ha-jun stared through haze, unsure whether he was begging for it to continue or end. The darkness changed first. Where there had been a solid black mass, the edges of stones appeared, along with cracks, slime trails, and thin movements of dust in the air. Ha-jun's eyes burned from within, and the cavern unfolded before him in gray-green layers, as if someone had pulled a thick blindfold from the world. Then the vibrations came. A drop of water falling somewhere beyond the wall passed through the floor as a faint tremor, and the distant movement of a small creature echoed in the bones of his fingers. Ha-jun pressed his palm to the stone, and the dungeon stopped being empty darkness, becoming a vast body with many hidden heartbeats. When he tried to push himself up from the floor, sticky whitish threads burst from his fingertips. They clung to the stone and tightened, nearly twisting his wrist, before Ha-jun jerked back with a strangled motion. The threads stretched from him like foreign veins, and the sight of them made his stomach knot with nausea again. Gradually, the convulsions retreated, leaving tremors and a heavy emptiness in his muscles. Ha-jun sat beside the torn spider corpse, staring at his fingers where thin threads still clung. The gray light of the orb returned to his memory, and now it seemed less like emptiness than a sealed door that had finally found its key. Power had not arrived like the blessings displayed at the altar. It had grown through blood, the vile taste in his mouth, and foreign flesh, forcing his body to accept what his mind could barely endure. Ha-jun slowly touched the closing wound on his arm, and a cold understanding moved through him deeper than any pain. He managed to stand on the second attempt, and his legs no longer felt entirely foreign. The pain in his rib remained, but his body held together more firmly, as if a new frame had formed beneath the skin. Ha-jun looked down at the dead spider, and in the yellow glint of his eyes, there appeared not a plea for rescue, but a hunter's hungry focus. As weakness receded, Ha-jun cautiously moved his fingers, trying to repeat the release of threads. At first, the web came out in clumps, stuck to his skin, and fell to the floor in wet scraps. Then one strand stretched more cleanly, fastened to a protrusion on the wall, and held when he pulled it carefully. The old rope lay nearby, stained with blood and spider fluid, while the new strand between his fingers was thinner than hair and stronger than it should have been. Ha-jun pulled harder, and his shoulder ached in response, but the web did not break. There was something frighteningly honest in that strength. The dungeon gave only what he tore out with his teeth. Dropping to one knee, he pressed his palm to the floor again. Faint waves passed through the stone, and each carried a different meaning. A drop, a small scraping creature, a distant heavy movement beyond several walls. The new sense did not explain the world in words, but it made his body understand danger before his thoughts could form. He returned to the place where he had fallen, stepping slowly to spare his injured side. Now the marks on the floor formed readable lines. Where the spider had crawled, where slime had drained toward the pit, where something small had recently hidden beneath a stone. Ha-jun understood that the dungeon no longer saw him only as food, but that knowledge did not make him safe. One by one, Ha-jun gathered everything that might still be useful. He wiped the knife against stone until only dark streaks remained on the blade, and put the lighter back into his pocket, almost gently. The backpack hung crookedly with a torn strap, but in this world, even a broken thing from home felt like the last thread to himself. Two paths opened from the cavern hall. One climbed toward the upper floors, where the church's routes might still remain, along with the people who had left him to die. The other descended into denser darkness, from which vibrations came heavier and less often, like the breathing of a sleeping beast. The thought of climbing upward first seemed natural, almost the only reasonable choice. But with it returned the archbishop's face at the edge of the abyss, calm and already prepared to record his death as a small loss. Ha-jun tightened his grip on the knife, and a thin gray shadow appeared beneath his nails again. After the archbishop's face came the others, Du-yoon with his shining sword, Min-jae with flames around his fists, and So-ra stepping back, as if Ha-jun's touch could stain her new destiny. These images did not ignite rage at once. They settled inside him like heavy stones, slowly building into another kind of will. Now he had power, but it resembled none of their clean gifts. It demanded flesh, pain, and the willingness to descend where the others were afraid even to look. Ha-jun ran his thumb along the gray scar on his forearm and understood that if he climbed upward with this faint spark, they would crush him again. A faint rustle near the corpse made him turn. Several small scavengers, like hairless rats with translucent skin, crept from a crack, and reached toward the spider's remains. Ha-Jun jerked his fingers, and a strand of web struck the stone beside them, sending the creatures scattering wildly into the dark. The scavengers vanished quickly, but left behind an important sensation. Not long ago, he had been that same trembling prey, waiting for the strong to decide his fate. Now even weak creatures sensed danger in him, and the change brought not comfort, but a heavy, hungry calm that settled deep inside his chest. The first step toward the lower stairs came more easily than he expected. His torn jacket clung to his shoulder, his rib hurt with every breath, and the vile weight of eaten flesh sat inside his stomach. Still, his body moved forward, because the depths now promised not only death, but the next prey as well. The stairway between floors had been roughly carved, with deep claw marks along the walls and old bloodstains near the steps. Ha-Jun walked slowly, keeping one palm against the stone and listening to vibrations rising from below. The farther he descended, the more clearly he understood that returning upward should begin only after those above could no longer recognize him. At the edge of the next floor, the air grew denser, and the mushroom light behind him faded as if the 10th floor were releasing him. Ha-Jun stopped on the final step and looked back toward the slime, the crack, and the dead spider. A part of the boy who had waited for help died there, and that death was quieter than the fall. Then Ha-Jun turned toward the darkness and stepped onto the 11th floor. The yellow glow in his eyes reflected across the wet walls, and thin web strands trembled between his fingers, ready to launch at the slightest motion. Something deep ahead answered with a low rustle, and the new bearer of a weak gray power walked toward the hunger that had only begun to teach him survival. The 11th floor greeted Ha-Jun with a low ceiling and the smell of wet soil. The stone here was darker than above, and mushroom light gathered in green pools along the walls. He walked with his fingers brushing the floor, and every faint vibration in the tunnels felt like a thread he could pull to find prey before prey could find him. During the first hours, he did not attack at once, though hunger scratched inside him again. Ha-Jun studied the narrow corridors, testing where stone crumbled underfoot, where dampness made the floor slick, and where webbing held best to ledges. Gradually, the cavern became a net of traps, and his body learned to wait with the patience of the creature he had eaten. By evening, the first minor goblin came through the passage, hunched, carrying a rusty pickaxe, its skin the color of old mold. Its steps struck the floor in sharp, greedy pulses, and Ha-Jun felt them before he saw the creature. When the goblin stepped into the loop, the web snapped upward, binding its legs and smashing its skull against stone. His drop from the ceiling ledge was clumsy, but enough. Ha-Jun crashed onto the goblin's back, one hand clamping its mouth, while the other drove the knife into the corded neck below the ear. The creature thrashed less than the spider, yet its fingers scraped the stone in an almost human way, and that motion held his eyes for too long. The dead goblin lay on its side, and there was too much recognition in its twisted face. The forehead, lips, thin neck, and fingers with filthy nails kept Ha-Jun from seeing the corpse the way he had seen the spider. Hunger, however, did not ask how human the prey looked. It clenched his stomach and pulled his hand toward the knife. The knife entered the flesh easily, and that ease nearly made him vomit before the first bite. Ha-Jun held a small piece to his lips until his fingers began to numb, then forced his jaw to close. The taste was denser, fattier, hotter in memory than spider meat, and with it came disgust at himself, rising up his throat. Absorbing the goblin was rougher than the spider. The pain did not burn, it pressed from within, as if his arm bones were being packed with stone dust. His nails darkened, lengthened by several millimeters, and scraped the floor with a metallic sound that made Ha-Jun jerk his hands beneath his chest. After several days, the upper floors became a map of smells, tracks, and trembling threads. Ha-Jun attacked lone goblins, dragged corpses into cracks, and ate only as much as his body could endure before the next fever. The skin on his hands took on a grayish tint, and small cuts closed faster than he could bind them. On the 20th floors, acid slimes appeared, shapeless lumps of translucent flesh that left smoking trails on stone. Approaching them directly was dangerous, so Ha-Jun began dropping web-tied rocks from above. When a slime burst open from the impact, he carved out the dense core with his knife before the acid could burn through the blade. The slime's flesh needed no teeth, but it burned his mouth until tears ran on their own. After the first core, blisters covered his tongue, and his fingers smoked where acid seeped through the skin. By night, the pain receded, leaving a strange tolerance for burning, as if his body had memorized the shape of a burn and learned to close before it. By the 25th floor, Ha-Jun moved differently, Webbing helped him cling to walls, his nails bit into cracks, and his body bent low before every open space. He thought less and less about how he looked from outside, because in the abyss, survival belonged not to those who kept a human shape, but to those who sensed another step first. One day, two goblins found the remains of his old hiding place and began picking through scraps of cloth. Ha-Jun hung above them, held by webbing beneath the ceiling, listening as their breathing scratched the air. The drop took less than a moment. 2 claw strikes, a brief rasp, and the stone accepted warm blood again. This time, his hands barely trembled. Ha-Jun cut the meat carefully, in small pieces, forcing himself to look only at fibers, veins, and whatever use his body could draw from them. Disgust still rose inside him, but now it had become part of the process, as familiar as the pain that followed mutation. By the 30th floor, his thinness had changed into dry, hard strength. The torn jacket hung from him in strips, but beneath the filthy cloth moved muscles that had not been there before. Ha-Jun noticed that the knife felt lighter in his hand, and the smell of fresh blood no longer brought only nausea. At the stairway down, he stopped and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Hunger, once an enemy, now rose inside him in a warm, dangerous wave, promising growth after every bite. Ha-Jun caught himself waiting for the next prey with impatience, and that thought frightened him more than the darkness of the new floor. The 31st floor greeted him with green mist layered close to the ground. The stone here was softened by moisture, marked with yellow stains and burst mushrooms leaking caustic sap. Ha-Jun covered his mouth with his sleeve, but after only a few steps, bitterness touched his tongue, and his eyes began to water. The first creatures of the poison caves were slow, and that deceived him. Acid slimes burst beneath rocks, blind lizards died in loots, and small parasites burned in their own venom when he flipped them with his knife. Each victory was short, filthy, and almost simple, so caution began retreating faster than it should have. After several days, Ha-Jun was eating venom in small portions, like medicine that had to be endured for the next step. The skin around his lips cracked, his nails grew darker, and wounds closed with gray scars. In the floor's vibrations, he heard more detail than before, and began to believe the floors were bending to his rules. On the 40th floor, the stone suddenly stopped answering with familiar pulses. The vibrations vanished so sharply, it felt as if someone had covered the entire passage in soft hide, and that should have warned him at once. Yet Ha-Jun took 3 more steps, before a long black shadow dropped silently from the ceiling. The shadow centipede uncoiled before him, filling the passage from wall to wall. Its carapace swallowed the green mushroom light, and its hundreds of legs moved with such unity that the floor seemed liquid. Ha-Jun released webbing at once, aiming for the head, but the strands blackened and fell apart the moment they touched the creature's acidic breath. His dodge came by a hair. The mandible struck where his chest had been a heartbeat earlier, and the stone behind him hissed, melting into smoking paste. Ha-Jun sprang along the wall, catching cracks with his nails, but the creature turned its head too quickly, as though it had already known where he would move. His claws struck the carapace with a metallic scrape. Only shallow grooves marked the black plates, and the recoil traveled through his arm bones so painfully that his fingers went numb. Ha-Jun retreated, feeling for the first time in many floors that his new tools were not cutting, only scratching the surface of a real threat. He tried to lure it into a web he had woven between acid-stained stalagmites. The centipede did not rush blindly after him. It stopped, raised its front segments, and exhaled a caustic stream onto the web's anchors. The entire trap sagged and melted, while Ha-Jun stood behind a ledge, feeling confidence turn to cold beneath his skin. Running became the only movement his body could perform without thought. Ha-Jun tore through the narrow hall, leaping over smoking pools, while the centipede shattered stone growths behind him without losing speed. Each strike it made left acidic marks along the walls, and the air grew so caustic that his lungs tightened with coughing. Near the boggy pit ahead, the mist hung thicker than in the other passages. The smell there was sharp and rotten, and the memory of the lighter's tiny flame suddenly became not comfort, but possibility. Ha-Jun slid toward the edge, deliberately smearing blood from his cut palm across the stone, so the creature would follow the scent more precisely. The web held his weight, though the acidic air was already eating at its edges. Ha-Jun swung above the pit, pressing the lighter to his chest, and heard the centipede stop directly beneath him. Its front segments rose, its mouth opened, and the green gas around them spiraled from the creature's hungry breath. His thumb slipped on the first try, and the lighter only clicked dryly. The centipede struck upward, one leg slicing his thigh, but the second click birthed a tiny flame. The gas ignited instantly, not like a campfire, but like a mouth of light opening wide, striking the cavern with a muffled explosion. The explosion tore Ha-jun from the web and hurled him into the wall. For a moment, every sound vanished except a thick ringing in his ears, while white spots drifted across his vision. Below, the centipede writhed, part of its carapace cracked by heat, dark fluid leaking from the seams between its plates. The chance was brief and filthy, like every chance the abyss had given him. Ha-jun rose on shaking legs, ran to the stunned creature, and hooked his claws into the open seam beneath its head. The knife snapped against the carapace edge, but his claws sank deeper, and he bit into the place where the flesh was soft and hot. Before dying, the centipede arched its whole body and struck blindly with its tail spike. The spike drove through Ha-jun's leg below the knee, pinning him to wet stone, and venom poured into his blood in a burning wave. He still held the torn flesh in his mouth when the pain climbed past his thigh, and the world darkened at the edges. After the creature went still, Ha-jun tore his leg free from the spike and crawled away, leaving an uneven trail of blood behind. A passage near the pit led into a blind dead end, narrow and low, where caustic mist gathered in a thin film near the ceiling. He dragged himself inside like a wounded animal and pressed both palms against the wound. His jacket lost several more strips of fabric, but the bandage soaked dark with blood almost at once. The venom moved quickly. The skin around the puncture swelled, turned blue, then filled with thin black veins. Ha-jun bit the edge of his sleeve to keep from filling the cavern with screams, while his nails scraped the floor beside his thigh. Fever rolled over him in a heavy wave and washed away what clarity remained. The walls of the dead end seemed to move closer to his face, then retreat, while the mushroom light smeared into long green streaks. His body tried to close the wound, but venom tore that work apart from within, and beneath his skin, a quiet war fought through every nerve. In delirium, Sora appeared before him again. She stood at the edge of the abyss, wind lifting her hair so beautifully that hatred almost became nausea. Ha-jun reached toward her, but his fingers passed through her face, and instead of skin, he felt only the cold mist of the poison cave. Behind her came the archbishop, white and calm as on the day of summoning. His shadow stretched across the ceiling of the dead end, spreading in centipede-like segments, while the golden halo behind him turned into a rotten circle. Ha-jun clawed at the stone, trying to rise, but his body only jerked and collapsed into another convulsion. The venom made his skin itch, as if hundreds of tiny legs crawled beneath it. Ha-jun tore lines across his chest and stomach with his nails, but relief did not come. Only fresh blood mixed with old. Somewhere deep inside, the centipede's foreign essence tried to claim a place, and his own flesh answered with pain. Hour after hour, the wound in his leg changed. The black swelling spread above the knee, then retreated, held back by gray scarring around the puncture. Ha-jun lay on his side, biting stone through a strip of cloth, and from the tremors in the floor, he knew small creatures were gathering at the entrance, drawn by his blood. When the first small creature dared crawl closer, Ha-jun raised a trembling hand. The web shot crookedly, but struck the scavenger's face, making it thrash and block the others from squeezing inside. That weak strike drained almost all his strength, but the dead end became his den again, not his grave. He chewed the centipede's flesh almost unconscious, pulling pieces from a pouch made from a torn strip of jacket. Each bite brought another wave of venom, and his body answered with feverish heat, as if forging antidote from his own blood. By morning, his breathing had steadied, though his lips remained blue. When consciousness returned, the cave smelled different. Ha-jun could separate poisonous mushrooms, acidic pools, and the centipede's decay in layers, as if the air had become a map. Clear drops gathered at the tips of his black nails, and the stone hissed where one of them fell to the floor. Standing did not happen at once, but the leg held his weight, though the puncture had left a deep gray scar. Ha-jun took several steps through the dead end, expecting the venom to flare beneath his skin again, yet the pain remained distant. His body had not fully healed. It had learned to live beside poison and carry it as its own scent. He dragged a nail across the wall, and the scratch smoked. The acidic venom was weaker than the centipede's breath, but caustic enough to eat into the flesh of smaller creatures. Ha-jun stared at the smoking stone and felt not joy, but wary respect for a power that had nearly killed him before becoming part of his body. The strangest change was not that. In the corner of the dead end, where mushroom light did not reach the floor, the shadow felt solid beneath his fingers, like cool water. Ha-jun pushed his hand deeper, and for a moment, his wrist lost its outline, dissolving into darkness, along with pain, trembling, and the smell of blood. He repeated the motion while standing, carefully shifting his weight into the dark corner. The world jerked, as if he had been pulled through a narrow crack. And a moment later, Ha-Jun stood by the opposite wall of the dead end. His stomach twisted, and his injured leg buckled. But the stone under his palm proved it was not delirium. Scavengers were moving again near the passage outside. Ha-Jun raised his hand, but instead of casting webbing, he stepped into the dark stain beneath the wall and let it close around his body. From outside, only yellow eyes flashed, and then the first scavenger shrieked as claws emerged from the shadow behind it. By the 51st floor, time had stopped being measured in days. It was measured in wounds, scars, and creatures whose properties remained beneath his skin. Ha-Jun descended lower, no longer hiding from every sound, but choosing among countless vibrations the one that promised more meat, more pain, and more strength. Saber-toothed wolves met him as a pack, circling him in a hall whose ceiling vanished into black height. Once, such a ring would have meant the end, but now Ha-Jun heard every paw through the floor, and saw where fear made their steps uneven. The first wolf leapt from the side, and Shadow Step placed prey directly beneath his claws. His claws entered the wolf's throat from below, leaving a smoking wound. The beast's body still moved with momentum, while venom already ate through its muscles, and Ha-Jun slipped into another shadow between two stones. The second and third wolves fell almost at once, tangled in webbing he had spun while moving. The saber-toothed wolf's heart was hot and tough, and Ha-Jun ate it, crouched by the wall, while the rest of the pack whimpered in a distant passage. Absorption brought no fever this time, but a sharp surge through his muscles, as if his body remembered how to leap, tear, and pursue. His teeth grew slightly sharper, and his breathing became lower and steadier. In the lower passages, stone beasts appeared. Slow, but so heavy their steps shook dust from the ceiling. Ha-Jun circled one along the wall, gripping cracks with his nails and trailing thin webbing behind him. When the golem turned its head, the threads tightened around its legs, and its own weight cracked its stone body against a ledge. Inside the stone beast there was no meat, only a dense gray core like a hardened organ. Ha-Jun split it with his claws and swallowed the fragments, feeling them scrape his throat. Later, the skin on his forearms became rougher, and small chips of stone bounced from it, leaving only pale marks behind. The chimera on the 62nd floor moved differently from the rest. Two heads watched opposite sides, and a tail tipped with bone left deep cuts in the walls. Ha-Jun did not wait for its charge. He slipped into the shadow beneath its chest and emerged at its side, slashing venomous claws across the tendons of its hind leg. The chimera spun, spraying saliva and blood, but every attempt to turn dragged it deeper into the net. Webbing laced with weak acid clung to fur and skin, while venom in the wound drained strength from its leg. Ha-Jun stayed beyond the tail's reach until both heads began moving out of rhythm from pain. The finishing strike was quick. Ha-Jun entered beneath the ribs, tore the soft place under the heart, and withdrew before the creature's final convulsion could break his shoulder. After feeding, he cut a wide strip of hide from the chimera, fastened it with webbing, and the scraps of his hiking jacket disappeared beneath a dark cloak of the abyss. The pocket knife broke against the rib of a stone beast several floors later. Ha-Jun lifted the fragment, turned it between his fingers, and placed it beside a dry wall like an object that had honestly reached its limit. The claws on his hands now cut deeper, and venom made every scratch deadlier than any old blade. Beside the knife, he left the rope scraps and the cracked flask. He looked at those things for a long while, because each smelled of campfire, forest, and the boy who had believed objects from home might help him return. Then Ha-Jun stood, and the chimera hide cloak slid over his shoulders, covering the last stains of his former life. On the 68th floor, movement became almost continuous. Shadow carried him behind prey, webbing closed escape routes, and claws left venom wherever a single touch was enough. Ha-Jun no longer planned every action in advance. Different parts of his body answered danger on their own, as if a pack of predators had gathered inside him with one breath. In the wide passage ahead, 3 predatory creatures with bony snouts appeared. They noticed Ha-Jun, lowered their heads, and took several steps toward him, as they would toward any lone prey. Then the air between them changed. His scent, his shadow, and his calm stride made them turn and flee back into the darkness. Ha-Jun stopped, listening as their retreat faded through the stone in uneven beats. His fingers released a strand on their own, ready to catch the last one, but he did not pull. For the first time, prey escaped not because he could not reach it, but because fear had begun working before his claws. At the descent to the 71st floor, he ran his tongue across sharpened teeth and tasted old blood. The hunger inside him was no longer merely pain, but direction, leading him lower toward creatures larger, older, and more dangerous. Ha-jun stepped toward the stairs, while behind him the darkness still trembled with the traces of monsters that had chosen life by fleeing. The 71st floor was wider than the caverns above, and its air was dry, as though every trace of moisture had died before his arrival. The stone walls were marked with old teeth scars, deep grooves, and dried blood the abyss had never washed away. Ha-jun walked between them in his dark chimera hide cloak, feeling the strength of dozens of devoured creatures shifting beneath his skin. Here, the chimeras did not attack immediately. They watched from cracks, moved in pairs, stirred the air with their tails, and tested his scent, as if they understood the cost of a careless strike. Ha-jun stopped in the middle of the hall, pressed his palm to the floor, and heard not a pack of beasts gathering around him, but a living hunting net. He killed the first chimera before the others committed. Shadow Step carried him beneath its neck. His claws opened the throat, and venom immediately forced the heavy body down onto its front legs. The others lunged almost together, but Ha-jun had already left web loops across the floor, and their own speed turned into the trap. After the short slaughter, the hall filled with rasping breaths that soon faded. Ha-jun ate in silence, choosing flesh near the joints, tendons, and dense pieces around the heart, where the strength felt richer. The bones beneath his shoulders began to ache, then lifted the skin in small ridges, as if his body were preparing supports for future armor. On the 78th floor, he reached a place where the ground was made of bones. They lay in layers, worn down, gnawed clean, long since fused with the stone, until a huge figure rose from the dead mound. The bone golem assembled itself from stolen spines, ribs, and skulls, and each step sounded like a graveyard breaking apart. The golem's blow split the floor where Ha-jun had stood a moment earlier. Stone fragments struck his arms and face, leaving small cuts that closed almost immediately into gray lines. He tried to enter the shadow beneath the creature's ribcage, but there was no true darkness inside the golem, only hollows filled with bone dust. So, Ha-jun moved onto the wall, hooking his nails into bones fused with the stone. Webbing stretched behind him in long strands, laced with venom and acidic saliva his body could now produce almost on command. When the golem turned, the threads tightened around its shins, and the heavy body leaned dangerously toward the pit at the hall's center. The fall did not destroy the golem, but it opened its ribcage. Ha-jun jumped after it, struck the bone pile, and dug into the crack between the ribs, while dead hands tried to close around him. Inside, beneath layers of white fragments, a dim core pulsed like a heart that had forgotten it was supposed to be alive. His claws could not break the core at first, so he drove his venomous nails into it and let acid seep through the cracks. Its pulse staggered, then the core split with a dry crunch, showering his face in white dust. When Ha-jun swallowed the fragments, the skin across his chest and forearms hardened into dense gray plates, heavy and painfully foreign. During the night, if the abyss could have anything called night, the pain moved into his back. Ha-jun lay among bones and felt something beneath his shoulder blades stretching the skin from inside, slowly, stubbornly, with wet cracking. Two uneven growths pushed from his flesh, like broken wing buds, and he bit into his cloak to keep from choking on a scream. When the pain receded, his body had become stronger and uglier. Gray plates covered his forearms and part of his chest. Painful wing buds stretched from his back, and his face had sharpened from long hunger and foreign instincts. Vibrations around him now went quiet before he arrived, because smaller monsters sensed not a hunter's steps, but the weight of something that had eaten too much. The 80th through 90th floors passed as a long streak of blood and stone dust. Armored beasts fell to venom in their joints, shadow birds tangled in webbing, and horned creatures shattered their horns against walls when Ha-jun unbalanced them with false sticks. Each corpse added another property to his body, but his mind struggled harder to keep them inside a human outline. Beside a dark pool on the 90th floor, he saw his reflection and stopped. A creature with human features stared back from the water, but its skin lay in plates, its eyes burned gold, and uneven bone growths shifted behind its back. Ha-jun ran a hand over his face, leaving a streak of foreign blood on his cheek, and the reflection copied him too calmly. After that, stairways grew rarer, and the passages between floors became longer and hotter. The stone beneath his feet held an inner heat, as if the depths of the abyss were nearing their own heart. When the gates of the 99th floor rose before him, cracks in their doors glowed red, and the air trembled with the strength of whatever waited beyond. The doors opened at a single touch, but it was no invitation. Beyond them stretched a magma hall, where rivers of molten stone cut the floor into islands, and the ceiling vanished in smoke. At the center stood the ancient dragonid Argad, leaning on a stone blade, and his molten eyes found Ha-Jun through the heat at once. Argad was taller than any monster Ha-Jun had faced before, but his controlled movement was more frightening than his size. Dark crimson scales covered his body in dense plates. One horn was broken, and his long tail left smoking marks on the stone. This creature did not thrash from hunger or lunge at the scent of blood. It measured its enemy. Ha-Jun attacked first, because waiting in that heat dried the throat and thoughts too quickly. Shadow Step carried him to Argad's side. His claws struck the ribs, but the scales rang like tempered steel. Sparks sprayed into his face, and the dragonid's answering elbows smashed into his chest, throwing him across the heated stone. Magma breath followed, broad and heavy like a flow of molten ore. Ha-Jun managed to shield himself with the bone plates on his arms, but the heat passed through them anyway, cooking the skin beneath in a wave of blinding pain. He rolled behind a stone ledge, smelling his own burned flesh, and for the first time in many floors, clenched his teeth in true fear. The shadow beneath the ledge was torn and unstable, because magma lit the hall from every side. Ha-Jun tried to sink into it, but the world pulled him only halfway, twisting his shoulder with sharp pain and throwing him back onto one knee. Argad moved toward him without hurry, and each step compressed the space more tightly than any wall. Webbing could not survive such heat. The strands flared, curled into black spirals, and fell to the floor before they could bind even one of the dragonid's legs. Argad's stone blade passed beside Ha-Jun's face, cutting away a lock of hair, then struck the ledge so hard that the entire hall answered with a rumble. Behind a broken column, Ha-Jun pressed his hands to his chest and forced his body to work with precision. Webbing burned on its own, but slime acid and centipede venom changed its surface, making the strands denser and wetter. He felt his fingers go numb from the strain, while the new mixture stretched between his claws in thick gray cords. Argad did not rush to finish him. The dragonid stopped near the column and watched the movement of his hands with cold attention, as if studying the mechanism of a new creature. That delay saved Ha-Jun, yet it also revealed the difference between them. His enemy thought, learned, and had no intention of becoming part of a simple trap. Ha-Jun burst from behind the column, not toward the dragonid, but upward. Acid webbing struck 3 stone supports above the arena and hissed, holding where ordinary strands would have burned instantly. He swung from it, flying over Argad's blade, and for the first time made the dragonid raise his head with visible irritation. Argad struck the nearest support with his tail. The column split, the web sagged violently, and Ha-Jun was thrown toward the magma river so low that heat licked his legs. He managed to drive his claws into the stone at the edge, but his soul smoked, and pain from the burned skin cramped through his stomach. Lying beside the magma, Ha-Jun felt a faint tremor through his palms. Above Argad hung a massive stalactite, cracked at its base by constant heat, but still held by a ring of stone. A direct strike could not pierce the dragonid's scales, but the weight of the abyss itself might do what claws could not. His wounded body had to be forced to move slowly, almost provocatively. Ha-Jun limped beneath the stalactite, leaving blood on the stone, then vanished through short, torn shadows without moving far enough away. Argad understood the bait too late, because his confidence in his armor made him take one more step forward. Acidic threads were already crawling across the stalactite's base, eating the cracks from within. Ha-Jun pulled with both hands, his back muscles seizing so violently that the undeveloped wings cracked beneath his skin. The stone above the arena trembled, then broke free, and Argad raised his blade just as the ceiling shadow fell over his head. The impact did not kill the dragonid, but drove him to one knee. The stalactite shattered against his shoulder, scales along his sides splitting into deep cracks, and heat poured from beneath the plates like blood made of magma. Ha-Jun lunged toward the wound, already feeling the chance narrow to only a few heartbeats. From his cloak he pulled a bone spike kept from an earlier hunt and drove it into Argad's eye. The dragonid struck on final instinct, claws tearing through Ha-Jun's gray plates and opening the skin down to the ribs. Pain nearly extinguished his mind, but he stayed on the enemy's body, gripping cracks in the scales with hands and teeth. When Argad fell, the magma hall shuddered as if one of its pillars had been lost. Ha-Jun tore open the dragonid's cracked chest, plunged his hands into the burning depth, and pulled out a heart, like heated stone threaded with living veins. The skin on his palms blistered, but his fingers would not open, because the whole abyss had narrowed to that burning piece of flesh. Argad's heart was too hot to hold, but Ha-Jun had long stopped expecting power to be comfortable. He bit into it, and heat passed through his teeth, tongue, and throat, as if molten metal had been poured inside him. The wound across his chest opened wider from the convulsion, and the magma light around him turned white with pain. Evolution began brutally, without warning. The bones in his arms cracked, then his legs, then his spine, and Ha-Jun struck his forehead against the stone because his body could no longer hold its old shape. Gray plates across his skin split, withdrew, emerged again, and crumbled into dust, while another structure assembled beneath them. The wing buds on his back tore through the skin, opened into uneven bony arches, and immediately began breaking inward. The pain was so dense that he stopped distinguishing separate wounds, as if his whole body had become one open mouth. The wings withdrew not by vanishing, but by hiding deeper, where the flesh learned to summon them when needed. Gradually, ugliness began arranging itself into order. Scale-like patches slipped beneath the skin, claws withdrew into the fingers, bones straightened, and wasted muscles filled with dense, quiet strength. Ha-Jun still lay in blood, but the silhouette on the heated stone no longer resembled a beast assembled from the remains of others. When he finally stood, the magma hall grew quieter. Ha-Jun looked almost human, taller, stronger, with clean facial lines and a body that no longer displayed each devoured creature as separate deformity. Only his eyes remained treacherously foreign, black, with narrow golden pupils, reflecting not the cavern around him, but the depth that had swallowed it. The power no longer shoved inside him like a chaotic pack. It obeyed, gathering beneath the skin, flowing through muscle, and rising outward as dense black armor, like a shell forged from shadows and magma heat. Ha-Jun slowly clenched his hand, and the armor along his forearm shifted with him, offering no resistance to the motion. After Argad, nothing guarded the path to the 100th floor. The gates beyond the magma hall opened on their own when Ha-Jun approached, and the heat immediately gave way to heavy cold. Behind the doors lay darkness of another kind, deep and motionless, as if the lowest floor did not breathe for fear of disturbing the one who had arrived. The 100th floor was not an arena, but a vast, cavernous emptiness, where creatures lived that made the monsters above seem like younglings. Their silhouettes shifted along the walls, many-eyed, horned, armored, yet none came forward. Ha-Jun felt their cores through the floor, and understood that each had chosen stillness as its only way to remain alive. One creature, so large its back vanished into the ceiling darkness, slowly lowered its head. It was not obedience in a human sense. Rather, the body of an ancient predator had recognized a deeper hunger standing before it. Ha-Jun walked past without releasing his claws, and the creature did not move until his steps had gone farther away. At the center of the floor, Ha-Jun stopped and listened. Once, every new level had promised new prey, new pain, and another piece of strength torn from the abyss. Now powerful flesh surrounded him, yet none of it called him forward, because his body had reached the limit of this place and demanded a different purpose. Turning back was easier than any descent before it. Behind him, a dark wing membrane opened, no longer a bony deformity, but a controlled part of his body, dense and flexible. Ha-Jun beat it once, and dust across the 100th floor spread outward in a ring, forcing the nearest monsters deeper against the walls. The ascent began in silence. Ha-Jun no longer climbed each staircase like a wounded boy with a knife. He crossed gaps on wings, slipped through shadows, and caught walls where passages collapsed. Floors that had once demanded days and blood now passed in gray layers, like memories that had lost their power over his body. On the 80th floors, monsters left the path before he appeared. On the 60th, old dens held only traces of hurried flight and dropped pieces of prey. Ha-Jun did not pursue them, because every delay felt unnecessary, and the hunger inside him no longer demanded any flesh placed before it. At the wall where he had once left the knife, rope, and cracked flask, Ha-Jun stopped. The objects remained there, small, dirty, almost absurd beside the black armor on his arms. He lifted the broken knife, held it between his fingers, and placed it back, because the memory of weakness no longer needed metal. Above waited the 10th floor, the slime, the crack, and the place where he had stopped waiting for rescue. Ha-Jun lifted his head, feeling the old vibrations of the upper tunnels, and not a single muscle moved across his face. The abyss had given him enough strength to return, but it had taken the boy who had once only wanted to be noticed. The 10th floor greeted him with the same smell of rot, but now it seemed faint, almost distant. The slime where he had fallen had dried around the edges, and the crack where he had spent a day looked narrow and pitiful. Ha-Jun ran his fingers along the stone near its entrance. An old fear answered, as a faint tremor beneath his ribs. The remains of the cave spider lay nearby, gnawed by scavengers in time. Once that creature had seemed like death itself, but now its dried legs looked ready to break under the slightest breath of air. Ha-Jun lingered beside it, because here the gray gift had first shown its teeth, and here began the road where flesh became the language of power. After that, the ascent quickened. Black armor covered his body, appearing and fading with the will of his muscles. Wings opened across wide drops, and shadows served as brief bridges between stairways. Monsters of the upper floors could not even understand what had passed them, only falling onto their bellies and trembling with their snouts pressed to stone. The first floor was cleaner than the others, because the church still stepped here at times. White seals remained on the walls, hiding the dungeon smell beneath a faint scent of incense. Ha-Jun stopped before the massive stone gates and felt a different air beyond them, living, wide, and real. The seals on the gates answered his approach with anxious golden light. When Ha-Jun placed his palm against the stone, gray-black energy moved through the symbols like wrought through thin cloth, and the lines began to crack. The church had built these doors to keep monsters inside, but had not imagined a creature that became deeper than the locks themselves. His kick struck the center of the seal. The gates did not open. They broke inward, shedding slabs of stone and golden fragments of ritual. The thunder rolled across the first floor and traveled back into the abyss, where thousands of creatures heard that the one who had descended as prey was leaving it as master. Light struck his face so sharply that Ha-Jun raised a hand before thought could catch up. The sun felt painful, almost rough after green darkness and magma heat, and his eyes narrowed into thin golden slits. For several moments he stood in the broken doorway, letting fresh air enter his lungs more deeply than the dungeon had ever allowed. Beyond the gates stood no cathedral like the one he remembered above. The dungeon opened into a wild forest, where old ruins were covered in moss, and church symbols on stones had faded under years of rain. Ha-Jun stepped onto grass, and the soft earth beneath his feet felt stranger than any monster, because it was not trying to kill him. The black armor slowly withdrew beneath his skin, leaving his hands smooth and human in shape. Ha-Jun turned his palms toward the light, studying fingers that hid claws, venom, webbing, and the strength to tear stone apart. From outside, he could seem human again, but every movement inside him answered with the echo of the abyss. Climbing a moss-covered hill, he saw only forest and distant mountains around him. The church had left no road, no guards, no traces of a recent ritual near the entrance. It must have come by magic, using the abyss like a hidden mouth. Ha-Jun clenched his fingers, and for a moment the air around his hand darkened with gray energy. The wind carried the smell of smoke, dry wood, and human dwellings. It was faint, but after the dungeon, any living scent cut through his senses brighter than blood. Ha-Jun turned his head east, where a thin gray line rose above the forest, and for the first time in a long while, the path was set not by hunger, but by the need to find those who knew the church's road. Wings opened from his back almost silently, parting the cloak and the air around him. There was no old cracking, no deforming pain. The membranes settled into the wind naturally, as though they had always been waiting for their first real sky. Ha-Jun beat them carefully, and the grass beneath his feet bent outward in a circle from the pressure. The first ascent was sharp, and the ground quickly dropped away, along with the broken gates of the abyss. Above the treetops, the air grew colder and cleaner, and sunlight struck the black armor that surfaced over his skin for protection. Ha-Jun flew unevenly, still learning the wind, but every wing beat carried him farther from the pit where he had been buried alive. From above, the forest opened in folds of green, hiding paths, streams, and dark gaps of old ruins between them. The smoke ahead was closer than it had seemed from the ground, and beneath it lay the roofs of a small settlement. Ha-Jun descended, folding his wings halfway because people might fear his shape before they could give answers. At the forest edge, he landed softly, almost without sound, and let the armor sink beneath his skin. The chimera hide cloak hid the traces of mutation, but his eyes still revealed a creature that had stared into darkness too long, and learned to stare back. Ha-Jun walked through the tall grass toward the village to learn where the church hid, and the world saw the devourer, under sunlight, for the first time. Grass caught at the edge of his cloak as Ha-Jun walked toward the thin line of smoke above the trees. The forest lived differently from the abyss. Birds fell silent before his steps, small animals froze in their burrows, and the air did not resist every breath. Even under the sun, his body kept listening to the ground, seeking dangerous vibrations before his eyes noticed movement. The village did not appear between the trees at once, as if it were trying to hide from the world. Several leaning houses stood beside a dry field, their roofs patched with bark and cloth, and smoke rose from a single chimney. People near the well froze when they saw the stranger in the dark cloak, and a thin woman dropped her bucket onto the dusty ground. The villagers' fear struck him in an almost physical wave. Children pressed against adults' legs, old people dropped to their knees, and men grabbed wooden pitchforks, as if already understanding how useless they were. Ha-jun stopped at the village edge and felt his own aura pressing down on these people more heavily than any weapon could. He had to force the power deeper. The black armor did not show, yet pressure still trembled around his body, like heat above stone, and Ha-jun slowly pulled it beneath his skin. His golden pupils narrowed, his breathing steadied, and his fingers hid beneath the cloak, so an accidental movement of claws would not turn fear into panic. An old man with a staff stepped out from the crowd, so thin that his robe hung on him like wet cloth on a branch. On his neck was an old burn in the shape of a church seal, the skin around it pulled tight into a shining scar. Mail came closer than the others, though his fingers trembled so hard the wood tapped against the ground. Ha-jun slowly raised his palms, showing that he held no weapon, though the gesture felt almost mocking after what his hands had become. The villagers did not relax, but several children stopped crying when the heavy chill of the abyss faded around him. Mail watched not the stranger's face, but his eyes, as if searching there to decide whether a man or disaster stood before him. On the way to the village, Ha-jun had killed a forest beast that looked more like a horned boar than an ordinary animal. Now he lowered the carcass from his shoulder and placed it on the ground before the well, stepping back so people would dare approach. The hunger in their eyes was familiar, but in them it did not become strength. It hollowed their faces from within. The woman who had dropped the bucket approached the meat first, her hands trembling from need more than fear. Others followed, slowly, like animals beaten too long for every bite. Mail did not stop them. He only studied Ha-jun more closely, because church punishers did not bring food to those they had come to punish. While the people divided the carcass, Ha-jun noticed identical marks on the doors. A white circle with rays had been burned directly into the wood, with numbers and dates scratched beneath it like debt marks. From the symbol on the village gate came the smell of old oil and blood, and the devourer's body answered with a dull irritation. Mail made a cautious gesture toward the strongest house at the edge of the square. The villagers parted not from respect, but from the desire not to stand between their elder and the creature that had come from the forest with dungeon eyes. Ha-jun followed, holding his aura inside, and every step felt strangely difficult, because he had to be lighter than his own strength. The elder's house was warm only near the hearth, where damp branches burned with more smoke than light. Empty clay bowls lined the shelves, and on the wall hung a wooden tablet bearing the same white church mark. Ha-jun sat across from Mail, and the bench beneath him creaked plaintively, as if sensing the weight of the abyss before the wood could. Mail did not begin explaining for a long while, though his eyes had already gathered enough suspicion. He studied the chimera hide cloak, the stranger's two clean hands, and eyes that did not reflect the hearth with ordinary human light. Ha-jun felt that the old man feared not his power itself, but the possibility that such power belonged to the church. Ha-jun raised a hand toward the wooden tablet on the wall and pointed at the white mark. The movement was brief, yet Mail turned pale as if a wound had been opened before him. The old man pressed his fingers to the burn on his neck, and that gesture said more than any explanation about who truly ruled this place. In the hearthlight, the mark on Mail's neck looked less like a symbol of faith than a brand burned into livestock. The scar disappeared beneath the old collar, and Ha-jun noticed newer burns layered over older ones. Inside him stirred not a flash of anger, but a slow tightening, like a predator preparing to leap after finally finding the right scent of blood. When Ha-jun indirectly made it clear that he had come from the place where the church had brought the summoned, Mail nearly stopped breathing. The old man's face sank, his eyes dampened with old terror, and the staff in his hand struck the floor. He recognized not Ha-jun's name, but the path by which the weak were led to a mouth, and told it was salvation. Mail did not begin at once, but only after locking the door with a trembling hand. Outside came the villagers' footsteps and the hurried cutting of meat, yet the air inside the house grew heavier than church stone. Ha-jun sat in half-shadow, hiding his eyes from the fire, so the old man could speak without seeing the depth of the abyss inside them. The elder took several wooden tablets from a chest, each covered in seals and cuts. Each mark meant a tax: grain, salt, children for service, blood for protection, payment for the right not to be declared servants of darkness. Ha-jun followed the marks with his eyes, and the meaning of church rule became rougher than any sermon. From Mail's account, images formed so clearly that Ha-jun almost saw them. White-clad collectors arrived after every harvest, took the best sacks, and left the village only enough for people to survive until the next debt. Those who argued were branded on the neck, and afterward, neighboring villages feared even selling them water. On a rough map carved into a board, the capital was marked by a shining circle, while the outskirts were small black dots. Mail showed how the fertile lands around White Dawn remained untouched, while distant villages fought monsters and hunger. The church called it protection of the world, but protected only the places where worship could be harvested. Ha-Jun's fingers rested on the edge of the table, and the dry wood cracked under the slight pressure. Mail flinched but did not move away, because the old man's fear had begun mixing with desperate hope. Ha-Jun forced his claws to remain beneath his nails and slowly withdrew his hand, leaving 5 deep marks in the tabletop. Then Mail spoke of the summoned. Such people had appeared before. Every few years, the church announced a new great campaign, showed the people heroes with bright gifts, and then those heroes vanished into sealed rituals. Officially, they died in battle against the great demon, but no body ever returned, and no village ever saw a saved world. The old man's words carried Ha-Jun back to the resonance orb. The gray light, Selena's fear, the priest's irritation, and the archbishop's calm now arranged themselves into a different pattern, far more frightening than humiliation. They had not merely dismissed him as weak, they had judged him spoiled food, unfit before being brought to the sacrificial table. Mail knew only rumors of the creature called the Great Demon. It did not ravage the capital, burn the rich fields, or touch the sacred lands, as long as the church performed its summonings. For the outskirts, that meant one simple thing. The monster and the saviors had divided the world between them, and the weak paid for their bargain. Inside Ha-Jun, revenge stopped being a hot image of tearing apart those who had laughed at him. It condensed into a colder shape, precise and heavy, like a claw before striking. If the church was part of the mouth, then breaking individual teeth would not be enough. The entire jaw that had ground people down for centuries had to be shattered. Mail showed the road to the capital, though his hand shook over the map. On foot, it would take weeks through forests and checkpoints. But by air, the direction was direct. Northeast, beyond 2 mountain ridges, where the white glow of cathedrals never faded at night. Ha-Jun memorized the line with a single glance. When Ha-Jun stood, the bench beneath him finally split. Mail lowered his eyes, because the restrained aura had begun leaking outward in thin gray streams. The old man did not ask him to save the village. His bent back held enough understanding that beings like this did not move for requests, but for a purpose that had already chosen its direction. Outside, the villagers had divided the meat, but no one ate in peace. Everyone watched the elder's door, and when Ha-Jun stepped out, the square fell quiet again, down to the ash whispering in hearts. He walked among them slowly, careful not to brush anyone with his cloak, because after Mail's words, these people were no longer part of a foreign world. They were evidence of a crime. At the village edge, wings opened behind his back, blocking part of the evening sky. The pressure of his strength escaped for a moment, and several villagers dropped to their knees, clutching their chests. Ha-Jun pulled the aura back immediately, but the earth beneath his feet had already split into fine cracks. A beat of wings lifted dust from the road and snuffed the weak flame in the nearest lantern. Ha-Jun rose above the rooftops, and the village quickly became a small dark wound in the forest. Mail remained by the porch, gripping his staff with both hands, his face lit not by fear, but by tired belief that what flew toward the capital was not a church angel. The northeastern wind struck his face, and Ha-Jun let black armor surface over his skin. Beneath him passed forests, dry fields, and dark roads along which the church had carried taxes, orders, and sacrifices for centuries. Now the same direction carried the one it had abandoned in the abyss, and with every wing beat, his revenge became less personal and more inevitable. The closer he flew to Iria's center, the more the land changed. Outskirts of dry fields and dark villages gave way to straight roads, tended orchards, and rivers guided by stone canals. Ha-Jun looked down and saw not blessing, but a carefully built feeding ground, where the fullness of some rested on the hunger of those he had left behind. By nightfall, the capital of White Dawn appeared ahead. White walls rose from the plain as if the city had been carved from bone, and golden domes caught the last sunlight so brightly they seemed to replace the sky. At the center stood the grand cathedral, its spires reaching upward with the same pride the archbishop had shown when turning away from a falling boy. Above the city, the air smelled of bread, wine, and incense. Even lanterns burned along the streets, people in clean clothing walked between shops, and children played near fountains, children who had never seen the burns on Mail's neck. Ha-Jun descended between clouds, and his shadow slid over white roofs, briefly turning the capital celebration into the wing beat of a predator. Inside the Grand Cathedral, a solemn ceremony was underway. The Archbishop stood at the altar in his white robe. Selena held her ritual staff beside the orb, and the summoned heroes lined up before them in new shining armor. Lee Do-yoon held the legendary sword at his chest. Min-jae displayed flaming gauntlets, and So-ra stood slightly behind, wrapped in a calm wind. In the weeks since the summoning, they had grown used to honor, faster than to real war. Their gifts shone brightly, but their movements remained too clean, too rehearsed beneath the gaze of church instructors. The Archbishop watched them with the gentle pride of a shepherd seeing his herd gain weight before the appointed day. Above the cathedral dome, Ha-jun hovered in the night air, holding his wings wide. Through the stone roof, he felt dozens of magical cores, bright and shallow, gathered in one place. Among them was one core stranger than the rest, deep, ancient, covered in golden light like rot hidden beneath fresh paint. Armor covered his body from throat to fingers, dense and black, swallowing moonlight. Ha-jun drew his wings closer to his back and folded his body for the dive, as he had done in the abyss before striking creatures too large to face slowly. Below, the hymn reached its highest note, and he fell before the sound could fade. The impact pierced the cathedral roof like a black spear. Stone, gold, and stained glass crashed down in a rain of shards, tearing the solemn hymn into screams. Ha-jun entered the hall with a cloud of dust around him, landing between the altar and the heroes who had once laughed while he fell. Dust settled slowly onto white robes, shining armor, and the faces of people who had believed themselves chosen only moments earlier. Ha-jun's black armor swallowed the stained glass light, and the crater beneath his feet spread cracks across the sacred floor. For one heartbeat, no one moved, because the cathedral had no prayer ready for the return of a discarded sacrifice. Lee Do-yoon recognized him first. The confident smile vanished from his face, and the legendary sword lowered slightly, as if memory had become heavier than steel. Min-jae stared at Ha-jun's black eyes and opened his mouth for an insult, but no sound came, because the pressure in the hall made even arrogance feel small. So-ra took one step back before she realized she had moved. The calm wind around her gift faltered, scattering loose strands of hair across her face. Ha-jun looked at her only briefly, and in that brief glance, there was no pleading boy from the cliff, only the memory of a hand letting go. The Archbishop's expression changed last and least. Surprise crossed his face like a shadow over polished stone, then disappeared beneath practiced calm. He raised one hand to stop the priest from panicking, but his eyes remained fixed on Ha-jun's aura, on the gray-black hunger that should have died beneath the earth. Selena stood frozen beside the resonance orb, both hands gripping her staff. The orb, which had once shown Ha-jun's gray light as shame, now trembled on its pedestal and filled with storm-like shadows. Cracks spread across its crystal surface, and Selena understood before the others that the power they had mocked had returned larger than the spell that measured it. A priest shouted that a demon had entered the holy hall. Ha-jun moved before the shout finished, crossing the distance with a single shadow step, and appearing beside him in the fold of a broken column's shade. One black-clad hand closed around the priest's throat, not squeezing fully, only enough to make the man understand what mercy from a monster felt like. When Ha-jun released him, the priest collapsed gasping at his feet. The heroes finally drew weapons and formed a shaky line, their training arranging bodies faster than courage could fill them. Do-yoon lifted the legendary sword toward Ha-jun, but the blade's light flickered at the edge, as if it too sensed the abyss in front of it. Min-jae attacked first, because fear had always made him louder than wisdom. Fire burst from his gauntlets in twin streams, rushing across the broken floor toward Ha-jun's chest. Black armor rose in layered plates, accepting the flames without retreat. And when Ha-jun stepped through them, Min-jae's grin died before the fire did. A single strike shattered Min-jae's right gauntlet. The explosion of stored flame threw nearby priests backward, and Min-jae screamed as sparks tore through his own arm. Ha-jun caught him by the collar, looked into the face that had once mocked a gray gift, and threw him across the cathedral into a row of marble saints. Do-yoon came next, fast and bright, the legendary sword carving a clean arc toward Ha-jun's neck. The strike landed on black armor and rang through the cathedral like a bell, but did not cut through. Ha-jun turned his head slowly toward him, and Do-yoon's eyes widened when the strongest gift in their group left only a shallow silver line. They clashed among shattered pews and fallen candles. Do-yoon's sword released blades of light, each one sharp enough to split stone, but Ha-jun slipped between shadows, letting the attacks kill statues and priests behind him instead. The hero's breathing grew ragged, not from effort alone, but from the realization that the enemy was learning his rhythm faster than he could change it. Ha-jun caught the sword on his forearm and let the blade sink halfway into armor. Before Do-yoon could pull back, gray-black tendrils wrapped the weapon, and the holy light along its edge began to dim. Do-yoon screamed and pushed more power into the sword, but that only gave the devourer more of its taste. So-ra finally moved. Wind gathered beneath her feet and lifted her above the broken floor, while invisible blades sliced toward Ha-jun from every side. He felt them through the air, rather than the ground, thin pressure lines against skin, and turned just enough for the first cuts to open shallow wounds instead of his throat. For a moment, So-ra's wind drove him backward. It filled the cathedral with screaming currents, lifting dust, glass, and prayer ribbons into a violent spiral. Ha-jun's cloak tore along one side, and one invisible blade opened his cheek, but the blood that fell from it was black and thick, sizzling when it touched the holy floor. Ha-jun stepped into the wind. Each pace cut his skin, but the black armor shifted, learning the angles of the blades, closing gaps before the next strike could enter. So-ra's eyes trembled as she saw him approach through her strongest attack, and the calm mask she wore since the summoning broke at last into fear. He did not kill her. Ha-jun appeared behind So-ra in the shadow of her own swirling wind, and struck the base of her neck with the back of his hand. The wind vanished, and she fell among torn prayer cloths, alive but unconscious, because some deaths deserve to wait until the truth around them had no walls left. The remaining heroes hesitated, and that hesitation ruined them. Webbing laced with dark acid spread across the marble, catching ankles, weapons, and shields before they could scatter. A healer tried to flood the net with golden light, but the strands drank enough of it to thicken, and Ha-jun moved through the trapped line like a shadow through reeds. Every blow was measured. He broke arms that held weapons, shattered knees that tried to retreat, and tore gifts open enough to taste without fully consuming them. He did not need to devour these shallow powers. It was enough to show the cathedral that its shining heroes were trained offerings wrapped in armor. The archbishop clapped once, softly. The sound was absurdly small amid the broken hall, yet every surviving priest froze at once. He smiled toward Ha-jun with the sorrowful expression of a saint forgiving a beast. But behind that mask, his ancient core tightened, and hidden symbols under the marble floor began to answer. Golden lines burst across the cathedral floor, forming a vast circle around the altar and the wounded heroes. Ha-jun felt the magic rise too late, not aimed at him directly, but at the gifts spilling from the summoned bodies. The archbishop opened his arms, and the floor beneath the heroes became a bowl of light. The first hero inside the circle screamed as his gift tore itself from his chest in a bright thread. Others tried to crawl away, but the golden lines caught their shadows and dragged them back toward the center. The archbishop's smile widened, and the cathedral finally revealed what its ceremonies had always been. Not worship, but feeding. Do-yoon, bleeding beside the cracked altar, looked at the archbishop with more disbelief than pain. The legendary sword slipped from his broken hand as light poured from his body into the ritual circle. Ha-jun watched the boy's arrogance collapse into terror and understood that betrayal tastes different when it comes from above instead of below. The dome closed softly, almost tenderly, cutting the remaining heroes away from the ruined cathedral and the bodies on the marble. Those who had reached it still looked outward with relief, mistaking the golden light for salvation. Ha-jun saw differently. The ritual lines beneath their feet were not moving outward to protect, but inward, tightening around their souls like a throat around food. Selena noticed first that the seals were not following the usual order. The rings on her fingers flared red, burning thin lines into her skin, and the staff in her hand trembled as if trying to escape. Her face went white with understanding, but the ritual had already taken control, and even the priestess became part of the mechanism she had served for so many years. The dome darkened from its edges toward the center, as if the gold were filling with blood. The heroes inside began striking the barrier, and their gifts flared together. Wind, lightning, light, stone, and healing slammed into the red surface. The dome did not tremble. It only brightened, drinking every attempt at resistance with a hunger too much like breathing. Colored streams began tearing from their chests and palms, drawing through the dome toward the archbishop. One hero's stone plates faded from his skin. Another's lightning peeled from her fingers into thin threads, and a third's healing light poured from his eyes. Every gift returned not to gods, but to the white figure standing at the altar. So-ra fell to her knees as the wind around her began unraveling. Turquoise currents pulled from her shoulders toward the dome, becoming long ribbons, and every torn-away stream left gray patches of exhaustion on her skin. She looked not at the Archbishop, but at Ha Jun beyond the barrier, as if finally understanding that at the abyss's edge he had seen what she truly was. The absorption quickened. Young faces aged within seconds, skin clung to bone, and shining armor became too large for bodies shrinking inside it. Several hands still reached toward the red wall, but their fingers turned into dry hooks before they could touch the light. Selena tried to step back from the altar, but red lines climbed her arms to the shoulders. The rings melted into her fingers, fusing with the skin, and the staff cracked, releasing a spray of pale sparks. The priestess collapsed beside the pedestal, her death nearly unnoticed, beside the dome devouring those she had called holy. The archbishop absorbed the powers with his eyes closed, and the white robe began splitting at the seams. Beneath the cloth moved not a human body, but several layers of foreign flesh compressed into a saintly shape. His shadow spread across the cathedral wall, unfolding long arms, horns, and torn wings before the shell itself had opened. Ha Jun felt a familiar principle, twisted through ritual. The demon did not eat flesh, did not take pain into its own body, and risked no collapse. It drained open souls through prepared channels, like a lazy parasite at a trough. The gray absorption inside Ha Jun answered not with hunger, but with deep disgust that made his breathing steadier. When the last stream of power entered the archbishop, the dome went out. Dried bodies remained on the marble, collapsed inside armor, and among them lay Sora with her wing-shaped hairpin gone dull. No wind moved her hair anymore, and her face had frozen with the look of someone who understood the cost of her choice only when nothing remained to pay with. The archbishop's human face split from forehead to chin like a thin mask. From within rose a creature more than 4 meters tall, many-armed, with horns of pale bone and a chest where a red core pulsed. Its wings resembled torn sheets of light, and each hand held the remnant of a devoured hero's power. The cathedral could not endure the unveiled power. Stained glass that had survived Ha Jun's entrance burst outward. Columns split with cracks, and golden symbols along the walls blackened at the edges. The demon unfolded at the altar, and its holiness finally fell away, leaving only the monster that had worn a savior's face for centuries. Between them lay dead heroes, empty priestly robes, and the shattered resonance orb, cracked by overload. Ha Jun did not move, listening to the demon's core beating in its chest with a heavy, ancient rhythm. The sound resembled the heart of the abyss, but held none of hunting's wild law, only the stored greed of something accustomed to receiving food on its knees. The demon recognized him as a ruined ritual. In its many eyes reflected not fear, but the irritation of an owner seeing a predator grow from the feeding trough. Magic thickened around the cathedral. The red core flared brighter, and Ha Jun felt the creature trying to find the old summoned channel inside him, to take him as it had taken the others. The channel did not open. The gray gift, forged through abyssal flesh, would not obey the church's seals, and the demon's attempt slipped from him like a hook from living stone. Ha Jun stepped forward, and gray-black aura collided with red-gold magic, filling the cathedral with the pressure of 2 hungers that had finally found each other. The demon's first attack joined the devoured hero's powers into one spinning storm. Min Jae's fire ran along the edges, So-Ra's wind drove it faster, and blades of light cut inside like fragments of the legendary sword. Ha Jun raised armor over his arms, but the impact still dragged him across the marble toward the cathedral's ruined doors. The outer steps met his back, and air tore from his lungs in a rough burst. Black armor across his forearms smoked, bright cracks spread through it, and the skin beneath burned down to flesh. The demon followed through the breach, too large for human doors, and around it gathered another crown of stolen magic. The square before the cathedral emptied in an instant. People in fine clothing fled toward side streets, dropping ornaments and prayer ribbons, but Ha Jun barely saw them. He rose to one knee, feeling the demon's steps through the stone, and understood that every strike here would break not only the enemy, but the city that had fed on its lies for centuries. Shadow Step should have carried him behind the enemy. Ha Jun dissolved into the shadow of a fallen column, but the demon struck there in advance, sending several spears of light into the darkness. One spear pierced his shoulder before he emerged, tearing him back out with a spray of black blood. Acid webbing flew toward the demon's arms in thick gray cords. Several strands managed to wrap around a wrist, hissing against pale flesh and leaving dark burns, but fire-laced wind tore them into ash at once. The demon did not merely possess the devoured powers, it combined them faster than Ha Jun could reshape his hunt. Dozens of light blades appeared above the square, resembling fragments of Do Yun's sword, only longer and colder. They fell from different angles, driving Ha-jun toward the center, where a ring of fire already burned the stone. He blocked some with armor and slipped from others through shadow, but two blades cut his side and thigh, leaving wounds his regeneration closed too slowly. Staying at range any longer meant death. Ha-jun charged straight through the ring of fire, letting the skin on his legs char, and struck the demon's chest with his claws. Venom entered the pale flesh, but the red core inside flared, forcing the infected tissue outward in clumps like unwanted filth. Several of the demon's hands closed on him at once. One gripped his throat, another his shoulder. A third caught a wing as it opened, and Ha-jun was hurled into the cathedral facade so hard the white wall collapsed inward. Ribs cracked beneath his armor, and his mouth filled with the taste of hot blood and stone dust. Chains of light wrapped around his wing before he could withdraw it into his body. Ha-jun jerked, feeling the membrane tear through living fibers, but the demon strengthened the chains with wind and fire, turning restraint into torture. The hunger inside demanded he rush closer, while pain made every breath in his chest sound like broken glass. The wing did not tear free at once. First, the bones at its base cracked, then the membrane split in a long, ragged line, and only then did the demon's strength rip it away completely. Black blood sprayed across white stone. Ha-jun dropped to one knee, and the square swayed before his eyes so violently that even hatred lost its edges. Regeneration tried to close his back, but the demon's stolen light prevented the wound from knitting. Smoking black flesh rose from the stump, only to fall apart in wet flakes. Ha-jun drove his fingers into the stone to stay upright, and understood that for the first time since Argad, his body could not restore what had been taken quickly enough. The demon rose above the square, held aloft by wings of light, and gathered a vast circle of magic around its body. Fire became the outer ring, wind the spinning wall, and light the sharp spokes aimed inward. Ha-jun lifted his head and saw an attack no defense could survive, because it erased space, not merely flesh. Within the spinning magic, the demon's red core beat steadily, protected by layers of stolen gifts. Ha-jun stopped looking at hands, wings, and light blades. All of it was flesh around the heart. The ranged battle belonged to the demon, but every creature with a core had a moment when it had to be seized not from outside, but from within one's own hunger. He stopped dodging. Black armor withdrew from parts of his body to stop wasting strength on defense that cracked anyway, and Ha-jun stepped into the fire-laced wind. Skin along his face charred. Shards of light entered his shoulders and stomach, but every step shortened the distance, and inside him the gray gift rose like a bottomless mouth. Spears of light struck at once. One pierced his abdomen, another his right shoulder, a third pinned his thigh to the marble, and Ha-jun collapsed before the demon in a pool of his own blood. The red core hung close enough for its heat to burn his face, and that closeness became the monster's first real mistake. Pain became motionless, enormous, almost calm. Ha-jun did not try to break free at once. He let the spears hold him, while his fingers slowly closed around one glowing shaft. The magic burned his palm down to bone, but through it he felt a path to the core, a thin, pulsing vein between the spell and the one who had made it. The demon leaned closer, certain its prey had finally stopped resisting properly. Several hands rose for the finishing strike, and the spears sank deeper into the body, making his organs tighten from heat. Ha-jun lifted his face, and in his black eyes there was no plea for time, only the exact measurement of distance to the throat. The lunge tore flesh around the spears, but Ha-jun did not let pain pull his body back. His left hand closed around the demon's throat, while his right drove into the pale chest near the red core, piercing flesh with claws and exposed bone. The demon jerked backward, but the devourer's pinned body became an anchor, holding them both in place. Gray absorption rose, not from his stomach, but from the wound in his palm. It wrapped the red core in thin smoky threads, not biting flesh, but latching onto the source of magic beneath it. The demon struck his face with a fist of light, breaking his cheekbone, but Ha-jun's hand only sank deeper into the chest, finding the center of the pulse. The bones of his right arm broke beneath one of the demon's hands. His wrist twisted, his forearm cracked. But the gray threads no longer held through fingers. They held through the will of absorption rooted in the core. Ha-jun tasted the stolen powers: fire, wind, light, steel, fear, and all of it poured through him in a poisonous stream. The stolen gifts began leaving the demon, but there was nowhere for them to return. They fell into the gray vortex around Ha-jun, broke apart, and dissolved into a hunger that did not recognize church seals. For a moment, images of dead heroes appeared in the air, not as souls, but as echoes of power, finally slipping from another's claws. Such power could not be taken quietly. The skin across Ha-jun's chest split. Blood poured again from the old wound on his back, and the light spear inside his abdomen began melting together with flesh. He coughed dark blood onto the demon's hand and kept pulling, because stopping now meant not survival, but returning everything stolen back into the monster. The demon lifted him along with the spears and slammed him into the marble. The floor collapsed, opening the cathedral crypt beneath them, but Hajun's grip did not break. The fingers around the demon's throat turned black to the wrist, and the gray threads around the core thickened, turning foreign magic into food his body could barely digest fast enough. Below, amid shattered stone, a crypt opened with rows of old bones. They lay in nameless church niches, the remains of past summoned heroes whose gifts had once fed the same red core. Gray absorption touched their dust in a weak wave, and for an instant the bones glowed, as if recognizing the first devourer who had not come to steal them for another master. The sight of the crypt changed the fight inside Hajun. He was not only pulling power from one monster now, he was tearing open a chain of feedings buried beneath centuries of marble. The demon howled, and for the first time, its voice lost the rhythm of command, becoming the sound of a beast whose stored food had begun to rot in its own mouth. The red core cracked. A single line opened across its surface, and from it poured not blood, but screams layered so tightly they became light. Hajun forced his broken hand deeper, gray energy chewing through the crack, while the demon's many arms tore at his back, ribs, and face, without finding a grip strong enough to make him release. The first explosion of power blasted through the crypt. Marble coffins shattered, old bones spun through the air, and the square above split wider, swallowing half the cathedral steps. Hajun felt his own heart stop for one beat under the pressure, then restart with a darker rhythm, synchronized with the dying pulse of the demon's core. The demon tried to flee upward. Torn wings of light beat frantically, lifting broken stone and bodies with them. But Hajun's gray threads remained anchored inside the core. He dragged himself with the creature, leaving pieces of black flesh on the cracked floor, and the movement looked less like combat than a corpse refusing to be separated from its grave. At last, Hajun bit into the core. Teeth broke against its surface, then sharpened under the pressure, sinking through the cracked red shell into boiling magic beneath. The demon screamed without words, and the sound burst from every church seal across the capital, shattering windows, prayer tablets, and the false calm of a city built around hunger. The core collapsed inward. Red light bent into gray, folded again and again, then vanished into Hajun's body with a silence far worse than the previous screams. The demon's limbs stiffened, its wings lost their shape, and the many stolen powers that had formed its crown guttered like candles with no air. For several moments, nothing moved except falling dust. Hajun remained kneeling in the broken crypt, one hand buried in the demon's chest, while black blood spread beneath him and mixed with ancient bone powder. When he climbed back into the square, dawn was beginning behind the city walls. Citizens hid behind doors, fountains, and toppled statues, staring at the black-winged figure emerging from beneath their holiest building. No one cheered, prayed, or cursed. The capital had lost the language that told it what a savior or monster looked like. Hajun stood on the ruined steps and looked over white dawn. The white city was cracked, its cathedral gutted, its priests gone silent, and its god revealed as meat. Yet the people below were not free in any clean or beautiful way. They were simply unowned for the first time, and freedom without shape looked very much like fear. Inside the cathedral ruins, the resonance orb lay split in two. Hajun picked up one half, and the surface reflected his face in fragments. Black eyes, golden pupils, pale skin, blood, and the faint red line now circling the depths of each iris. The gray light that once condemned him moved through the shard like a quiet storm. He closed his hand, crushing the orb fragment into powder. No priests remained to name his gift. No ceremony remained to measure him, and no summoned hero remained to stand between him and the throne that had commanded their deaths. Hajun walked through the ruined nave, past Sora's body, past Do-Yun's broken sword, without slowing. At the altar, the archbishop's throne still stood, cracked but upright beneath a curtain of dust. It had been built for sermons, judgment, and the soft lie of divine guidance, but now its white surface was stained with ash from the demon's corpse. Hajun stopped before it, and the silence of the ruined cathedral gathered around his shoulders like a cloak. He sat on the throne without ceremony. The stone cracked beneath his weight, not from body alone, but from the pressure of the abyss coiling within him. Outside, bells began ringing wildly across white dawn, some pulled by terrified hands, and others swinging loose from broken towers. The sound spread over the capital, and beyond it, toward roads, fields, villages, and distant borderlands, where branded people looked up without knowing why their chests tightened. In Mail's village, the old elder stepped outside before sunrise and heard the bells on the wind, faint and impossible. He touched the burn on his neck and began to weep without smiling. On the throne, Ha-jun did not close his eyes. The demon's memories came in broken tastes. Rituals, bargains, the first summoned heroes, the first feeding, and the church built around a monster, until monster and altar became indistinguishable. He let the memories pass through him, keeping only the paths, names, and hidden sanctuaries that still belonged to the same rotten jaw. His body changed once more, but quietly now. The red veins in his wings dimmed into black. The golden pupils narrowed, and the black armor across his chest slowly closed the last open wound. Ha-jun leaned his head against the cracked backrest, and dawnlight touched his face without pain for the first time. Through the breach in the wall, the capital was visible, shaken yet alive. People stepped carefully into the square, moving between broken statues and white prayer ribbons stained with dust. No one yet knew the church had been beheaded. The fear had already changed direction. It no longer rose toward the cathedral-like prayer, but flowed down from it into the streets. Gray-black aura rose around the throne slowly, neither tearing the stone nor pressing its full weight upon the city. It gathered above Ha-jun's head in a ragged, smoky crown that did not shine and did not ask for worship. It was a sign not of divine mercy, but of power born from the pit, where the weak had been thrown for others' comfort. Inside him, all the devoured powers stirred, but they no longer pulled the body in different directions. Spider, goblins, centipede, chimeras, argad, and the demon's red core dissolved into one center, obeying a will that had passed through every pain.